Conversations on Co-Production is Expert Link's free monthly meeting where people come along to chat all things co-production with like-minded individuals. These podcast episodes are taken directly from the conversations. So if you like what you hear, come along and join us by signing up via the link below.
For me, I think there's two elements within co-production when it comes to power, and I think both of them are really interesting. So one is, how does power get balanced from outside the co-production project or system or group? How do you balance the power of the so-called decision makers of what you're trying to feed into? Who holds the power in, what goes forward and what doesn't go forward? And how you balance the needs of the group or the project and the people that usually hold the purses and the decision making. And there's something also interesting around power within the group. So I think it's interesting to think about how we balance the power of and the dynamics of the group themselves. So how do we make sure that we incorporate introverts and extroverts, people with different accessibility needs, different ways of communicating? And I think quite often within co-production groups, you get quite verbal people. So I think there could be a power imbalance within the group as well as the group and externally.
So yeah, I think it's important that somebody who is invited to take part in something or help improve something knows that what they're going to say and their views and opinions are not going to be talked down or dismissed by anyone. And I think that's part of the power thing. And also that anyone in maybe senior management, higher up in an organization, knows that when they come into a project, a setting where there are people who are non-professionals there that whatever they say equally may be challenged, and they should expect that what they say isn't going to be necessarily accepted, and that they come and realize that, and that they're able to understand that it's not a staff meeting or a staff gathering, and they can't just bang the fists or use their position in order to try and relinquish regain some power and control.
I was in a meeting yesterday, and someone was talking about what they were doing further up the country with co-production. They said they'd put on a huge meeting with NHS professionals, people with lived experience, and they said they made everyone leave their ID badges at the front door when they came in. They said, because all the while you're in this room, everyone is co-producing this workshop or this activity, and it instantly made that power imbalance drop significantly, because they knew they'd left their IDs at the door, and they said they didn't know if they were sat next to the chief exec of a company, or whether they were sat next to someone who was high in the NHS. They were all just sat around the table working together.
So I think a recognition that we as facilitators hold quite a lot of power, and I think with that comes responsibility to make sure that we are co-producing throughout, that we are not sort of making decisions without the group themselves, that we're not having hidden conversations behind the scene, because I think we have a duty of care to make sure if we are fully co-producing something all the way through, that we make sure that our communication is really clear with the people that we're working with. And I have had some experience of working with staff who want to co-produce something alongside you, be it commissioners or strategic staff, around a project, and then the agenda changes or the budget changes, and what was originally going to be co-produced can then, the values of co-production can get lost, I think, somewhere along the process. So for me, I think there's something really important about making sure that we are checking in and making sure that the co-production values go throughout a whole piece of work and a whole project, and that doesn't get diluted along the way, because then the power differential between this co-produced project can then become something where the power then sits with the people with the money and the people who are the decision makers, rather than it being something that you're doing together as a project.
Yeah, I was going to sort of touch on the sort of the tick box exercise. And it's a big flash word at the moment, and it's been talked about in lots of meetings, and there's people being recruited like me to support co-production groups, but actually, like, that needs to happen is the culture change along the way. I think that is starting, especially in the organisation I'm working in, where they set up independent co-production groups to change and influence recommissioning of services. I'm very new to this role, so I'm still learning, but I can already see where things are sort of like, well, it'd be just easier if we just get on with it. And part of my role is to say no. I've got a great bunch of people that really want to get involved. So, but yeah, traditionally it's always been very unbalanced. So I think it's going to take quite a while for things to change fully.
And I think I mentioned it just now, but where does the co-production activity originate from? Who had the idea of, actually, we need to co-produce something here? We've got this idea, but it needs to be, because often it's either a funder, where obviously there's objectives or KPIs or whatnot that we need to make sure that we're reaching. There's often sort of targets that we need to make sure we're hitting. So funders, whether it's come from beneficiaries, services themselves, government departments, all of these areas and sectors are involved in co-production. And I think depending on where that has started, it does vary where that power sits. I think we've had discussions before around like the difference between involvement and co-production, and I think that they obviously hold their own merit, and they're important. There's importance for both, and all the bits in between. But I think it's really worth bearing that in mind, is that who holds the power right at the start, and what does that look like when you get started?
I'm not sure. I'm thinking it's really interesting having this conversation today, because I'm not sure how we can ever have an equal power distribution, I think, when we do this work. I think my views are that however we want to co-produce something, at the end of the day, the staff working alongside us are the ones that are responsible, I think, for that piece of work. I think for true co-production to be done, I think you can do it within the voluntary sector a lot easier, I think, than you can working with the public sector and statutory providers. I think they always have this sense of responsibility that they make the right decisions because they're using public funding. And I think in the voluntary sector, we're much more fortunate that we can be much more adaptable and flexible and reactive to people we're working with in terms of co-production. We have a lot of issues around when we're working alongside, particularly again, the statutory sector, around language that's used and overly complicated papers and documents and resources that we are expected to get our heads around. And I think that educational attainment and that expectation that everyone has the same level of English as the people that work in that sector is a real issue around power. I think this need for using specific terminology and jargon, and not just that, just the way things are worded in such a way that it really is very difficult, I think, for people just wanting to access any type of co-production activity has to manage these documents that come to us, and how do we have to reword it more often than not so that it makes more sense. So I think there's definitely something around making sure that what you're working with, the resources you're working with, and the documents are as plain English as they possibly can, and that anyone can understand them, because otherwise that power balance of you don't understand the specific terminology that's being used or what's going on in that specific service really causes people's a lack of confidence, and a lack of, I'm not as good as you because I haven't had a degree, I haven't gone to college and done that pathway that for your career that you've chosen.
And accessibility, and we have a forum every couple of months, and we'll always make sure that what is given as information before the meetings isn't too overbearing, and is in a way, because I may get handed something, and this is still how it works. I may get handed something, results of something to share. That we've got the beauty of sharing with the group, a case in point, the upcoming meeting is, was quite a hefty dozen pages worth, and I wasn't able to sort of crunch that down very much, but I'm very aware that that's a lot for someone to digest before a meeting, particularly if it's the first time to a meeting. So we would typically not sort of put forward quite so much information to people. Our organisation has a commitment to co-produced service as well. That's obviously according to decisions made, I guess, by our board's trustees. Sounds great, but in practice, there's an awfully long way to go. In doing that, we have a programme where anyone in services is invited to help co-produce action planning. That's very difficult. The entry points to that are difficult. Even just explaining that to staff is difficult. A lot of the action planning I see coming back, it's pretty good, it's all right, but it tends to be just around basic asking questions, getting answers, and it tends to then be still staff scurrying around trying to produce the answers or the actions for people. So lots of things still to be done to try and even reduce that that power, let alone balance it up. Lots of different areas to work on.
We've had multiple different experiences, so we're supporting people with lived experience to help co-produce a mental health transformation program, and quite often there has been a lot of barriers, I think, to supporting people to attend more strategic meetings. So they're happy for you to be involved at the lower end, or I'm going to say the lower end, but the more sort of general information, consultation, involvement end of the spectrum. But when it comes to sitting alongside staff in workshops or sitting alongside staff in higher up boards and decision making, where the money gets spent, how the priorities are decided. There's a lot of, well, we don't have service users in this environment, we don't have people with lived experience here, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to sit here. So the transparency gets lost the further you go up the ladder. Having said that, where we have managed to do it, and we've only been doing this for like 2.5 years, and where we have managed to do it, we've really transformed the way people think about people using services, and the way that it can be really meaningful in experience for everybody on that board or as part of that workshop, having people work alongside you with not a staff hat, let's say, people, carers and people with lived experience, and opening out that sort of discussion, I think, around the table for what gets decided and what gets voted for to go forward. So and I think that can be really positive, but you need to sort of be able to work with people to get there. And I think there are lots of barriers, and we are quite strict around making sure that papers go out well in advance, that we have pre-meetings with the chairs of those meetings, and then we have checkouts as well. And there's quite a lot of work and time put in around co-production, and to do it well and meaningfully for everybody does take that. And I think as people struggle trying to fit in meetings, and this part of the work often gets left out after a little while, even though they mean well. When they start something up after a while, it's like, well, we don't have time to do that anymore, or you should be okay now because you've been going to several meetings, or so it's about how to keep it going long term, I think, and make sure that people feel completely included in the process. And for us, it's still a work in process. There's lots of places we're not allowed to be, even though for us, co-production is seeing it all the way through to the delivery, and then the ongoing monitoring, evaluation of that process as well. So it doesn't just end when you deliver a service or whatever you've co-produced. It goes on. And how do we make sure that we're in those contracts meetings? How do we make sure we're in those evaluation meetings? So it goes on and on for us, and we push back, and we often find that things happen and things change, and we can be more respected, I think, because we open out some of those avenues for people to be where they haven't been before.
We just put an event on last week where we actually had our expert by experience host that event and run the pretty much compare the whole event. So you had a whole room of GPs and psychiatrists and people that work in mental health services, and we supported an expert by experience to host the day, changing that power dynamic around. And it was an amazing event, really, really good, really, really well. So I know that once that expert by experience goes back into their strategic meetings that we support them in, that power dynamic is going to be completely different the next time that person goes into the strategic meeting, because they have hosted the entire workshop that we put on, and they're hosting another one tomorrow. And I think that you can change that power dynamic if you just give the person with lived experience a bit of support and give them that faith that they can run a workshop or run an event.
So something we've done in some workshops that we've delivered is not have titles or job, sort of like organisations identified with people sitting around the table. It doesn't always work in strategic meetings, because I think it's quite obvious who is sitting there from a staff point of view. Even by like the background, I recognise the fact that people with lived experience quite often have no background, so it's quite noticeable online. But certainly in workshops, we've really encouraged people we're working with and co-producing to not just use our first names and our pronouns, and not actually share any job titles, because that just immediately introduces that level of, oh, well, this is a chief executive, or this is a strategic lead of such and such, and oh, I don't know as much as they do. So that, I think that's really helped in some environments, but it's it can't always happen that way. I do understand that.
Not just thinking about how can we train the people with lived experience to be in these spaces, but also give training to the other side of the coin to make sure that they understand the, you know, the whole process, why we're doing it like this, the benefits of that, but also that power will, you know, have to be shifted in this way, and sort of doing it through that approach, I think, because could be helpful.
That's something that we try to do with any sort of co-production activity, is that you bring everyone to the same level, you know, whether that be someone, an expert by experience, whether that be a commissioner, everyone has the same, you know, the same sort of training, because you can't make assumptions. You can't assume that anyone has been in this sort of space before or knows how to communicate effectively. So I think it's really valuable to offer training to everyone involved. Also, I think we normally try to have like a pre-meet before, where you discuss, you know, what it is that you are planning on doing, what activities people think that should be included, but also to design what we call a safe space. But it's basically just, it's co-designed in terms of how we communicate with each other, and it always ends up, there's common themes, you know, in terms of how we speak to one another, and although those types of generic things, but they do change slightly each time. So it is important, I think, to do it with each group that you work with. As someone, you know, new people will bring new things in all the time. So just finding that sort of common ground, I think is really important, and it gives people the opportunity to connect as people, rather than that you're just here for a purpose. You know, actually being able to connect is really, really quite important as well.
When you do something that's positive, just to celebrate it and share it, you know, like let other people know what has happened, you know. So we'll, you know, I'll be dining out on this EBE running this event for the next month or two, because I'll be telling everyone about it to try and give people that bit of momentum and say, look, you know, people with lived experience can host events and can be on that, can shift that power balance in the right direction. And hopefully then other people will hear of that story and go, yep, maybe I could, you know, get more involved, or see the value of their voice, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Especially if there is budget cutbacks and cost of living crisis, having lived experience has more value now than probably it has done in a long time.
Just sort of summarized what we've spoken about and how we can potentially rebalance it, or at least bring everyone up to the same level in terms of opportunities. So someone mentioned being honest, being transparent. You know, if things aren't going to work the way that you thought they were going to, just be honest with people in terms of what they're able to contribute, or what you're actually able to do with the result of the co-production. I think often we give people all of this wealth of opportunities, and then we don't actually follow it up afterwards. So yeah, just being really honest and transparent, having open communication, I think falls into that as well. Being brave, I think that's a sort of underlying theme that came to me when we're talking about our own experiences, is that often people who hold on to power, that it's, you know, if they're brave, and I think that was you know, in terms of bravery, Ricky, I think having people go to the meeting which is chaired by an expert by experience, that is quite brave in itself on both parties, you know. So allowing space for that bravery is important, and being open to be challenged, I think, is also one that you know, where people can, there's like that resistance, isn't there, of actually this doesn't feel comfortable, like this isn't how we do it, and we're going to just continue doing it the way we normally do. But I think all of those types of things come down to the individuals that are involved and like the culture of organisations. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and I think it's still quite a lot of work in progress, but it seems like there's some really good people out there sort of advocating and doing great work.